the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Eitizaz, and this matters. Have you ever had to think about a much-loved parent or grandparent getting older in front of you and how you would like them to be cared for when they will really need it? The terrible tragedies playing out across Ontario's long-term care homes through this pandemic has brought heartbreak, but also hope and a reckoning. Maybe now is the time to force real change, to overhaul infrastructure, and more importantly, to reshape the way we look at long-term care and the elderly of our society. And maybe it's also time to have a larger conversation about race and culture within long-term care. Advocates and families are calling for culturally relevant long-term care for Canada's aging immigrant population, which includes more people of color than ever before. Olivia Bowden is a reporter for The Star, and she's been working on this for an upcoming piece. And she joins me today to talk about what we mean by cultural relevance in long-term care and why we need it. Hi, Olivia.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So, Olivia, what do we mean when we talk about cultural relevance in long-term care?
So, cultural relevance and ethnocentric care within long-term care, what that really looks like is incorporating all the elements of who someone really is into their care as a senior. So that can be everything from ensuring there's staff who speak their language, to ensuring there's food that they're used to eating, that they've grown up eating their whole lives, to also making sure that, the celebrations that they've been doing with their families are, built into the framework of the long-term care. Because when we say long-term care homes, we really want that to feel like a home. And that's something that, I think in the last year has really shown us is really just deeply missing from Ontario's long-term care system, especially.
Right. This conversation has really sparked from what we've seen in the last year. And long-term care homes, like you said, are homes. They're not storage units for the elderly, right? And I think the story of Suresh's mother in your piece, it really speaks to what we're talking about and how something like this could impact someone who is already feeling lost. So tell me about Indirani.
Sure. So I spoke to Josh Suresh and his mother, Indirani. She was in long-term care for several years. She was diagnosed with dementia, and she's an immigrant from Sri Lanka. And they came here in the 80s with a teenage Josh and his siblings. And once she started to get dementia, a common thing that happens with, seniors with dementia is if they have a first language and several other languages that they speak, the doctors I spoke to, they often revert back to their first language and they revert back to their earliest memories. So that's, what you grow up with as a kid, as a young person. And for people who are immigrants, those elements are crucial to how they feel in their long-term care home if they have dementia. So she reverted back to only speaking Tamil, even though she could speak fluent English before. Now she could only rely on Tamil to communicate her needs. And the difficulties of communicating your needs when you have dementia and it's progressing, it just gets harder and harder. And, you lose the amount of words you're able to say. So she already was dealing with limited speech, and now she can only speak Tamil. And in this home, there wasn't anybody who could speak to her in Tamil. There wasn't food that she was comfortable with. At home, she was eating string hoppers. She was eating dosa. She was eating idli. But now in this home, she's not dealing with food that she grew up eating, that she's comfortable with eating. And there's no one there who could really communicate with her. So what Suresh told me is that he said she went completely into a shell. She stopped speaking to anybody because it's kind of a form of giving up. If nobody can understand you, then why would you want to keep speaking? So that happened. And also he said within the first 2 months of her being there, she lost about 40 pounds because she was just uncomfortable. And he ended up hiring a ESW with a Tamil background who could speak Tamil to go into the home and feed her, because that was the only way that she could be convinced to eat, is someone speaking in Tamil to her. And she died in 2019. And he said that those last few years were just awful. And of course, no one wants their relative to be in long-term care, and not feeling great about having a relative in long-term care is, of course, it's a universal experience. But for someone like his mother, feeling lost and alone when you have dementia, it just becomes 10 times worse when there's no one there who truly understands who you are.
And it just sounds like a nightmare and very draining for the family as well as Indirani. So, Olivia, this one-size-fits-all kind of framework in Canadian long-term care, how does this leave a gap when we talk about what Canada really represents today in terms of multiple cultures, races, and religions? And in your piece, you also talked about the need to look at this from a historic lens. So can you take me through that a bit?
Sure. So I looked at a lot of reporting done by the Wellesley Institute, their research institute in Toronto, and trends in Canada are similar to other nations like Australia and the US in terms of when their immigration policy switched to allow essentially more people of color. In the mid-1970s, we had new immigration legislation be ushered in that really opened the doors for more people from countries that weren't European and weren't white-focused immigrants to be allowed into this country. Prior to that, Canada had overtly discriminatory policies against people from various nations, including China, including India. Chinese immigrants were banned actually from Canada for a solid almost 25-year period between the early 1920s and the late 1940s. So, we had a clearly discriminatory policy, but that changed. So, you see a much larger wave of immigrants that include more people of color coming into Canada starting in the late 1970s. And then by the time you get to the 90s, the biggest countries that people were immigrating from, the biggest regions rather, were China and South Asia. So now we're looking at 30 years, 40 years on from those policies changing, and the people who came here as first wave immigrants, they're aging. And that's showing up especially in urban centers like Toronto and the GTA, where these populations are not minority populations. They're not, quote unquote, visible minorities. They're seniors that are approaching the majority of our population. And between 2006 and 2016, we actually had a 94% increase in Toronto of seniors who were quote unquote visible minorities. So seniors who have these cultural needs, they're not just a few seniors. This is quite a large portion of seniors in Toronto and the GTA, and it's only getting larger. And this is a trend we're seeing in other countries too, like I mentioned, like Australia and the US. But in terms of actually tackling how to better support those seniors, based on my research and based on who I've spoken to, we haven't gotten there yet.
As you mentioned in your reporting, there's a crucial link between dementia and the need for cultural relevance in care. Can you talk to me a bit more about that?
Sure. So the majority of people in long-term care, they're in those institutions because they've reached a point where families can no longer care for them at home, because I would say that most people would not want to put their relative into this kind of setting. But it comes at a point where there really isn't a real choice. You don't have a choice anymore. And this shows up in the data for long-term care homes. So it's 64% of people in Ontario long-term care homes have diagnosed dementia, and 90% of people in Ontario long-term care homes have some sort of cognitive issue. These are the most frail, vulnerable members of the percentage of seniors in Ontario. It's already the most vulnerable portion of those people. And in terms of their needs around cognitive issues and dementia, a lot of my research and studies have shown that having those cultural elements and having just daily cultural care that you can interact with, it really changes how fast dementia can progress. It changes how fast someone can decline. And, I looked at one study from Norway where it showed that seniors from specific cultural backgrounds, they became more distressed when they didn't have things that they were used to. And by being used to, I mean things they were reverting back to from what they were comfortable with, from what they were growing up with. And the distress increases when you can't communicate your needs because you no longer have your words. So they're getting agitated. They're more prone to violence. They're more prone to outbursts, and they're more prone to just general declining without having those. So without having someone tell you it's okay in the language you're comfortable speaking, without hearing the music that you grew up with just being around, that can make a huge difference. And even just cultural customs that you're used to, all of those can just add comfort to your general well-being. And it can actually slow the progression of dementia for these seniors so they're not declining at an accelerated rate in these long-term care homes. Because seniors with dementia, you're already taking them out of their homes, their comfortable environment, into an institution. That's already going to contribute to their decline. And then when you remove all these other elements that really make up who the person is, they're a human being. And when you remove all the elements that make them people, obviously it gets much worse for them. And that's essentially what's happening without that cultural care being readily available.
We'll be right back. This is never easy for anybody, for families who are going through a process like this. And I can speak to my South Asian origin, but I know it's pretty common in other immigrant communities, the way we perceive senior care. And many times we try to care for parents as long as possible. But also alternatives are limited, aren't they? Could you paint a picture of what kind of barriers families are facing?
The type of barriers in terms of just cultural elements in our healthcare system in general are a huge issue. So if we want to just keep it to caring for seniors, even if they don't have dementia, in terms of doctors who are culturally competent, who understand certain customs in certain communities and can speak to those and can provide comfort and understanding in a different way than a doctor who's not from that community or can't speak that language can understand. So it often falls on cultural community associations to bridge that gap and provide care. And what the Wellesley Institute has seen happening, especially in the Toronto GTA area, is that many families within immigrant communities are keeping seniors at home, not because they're able to look after them, but because this is the only way they see that they can take care of them, because our long-term care homes do not have the cultural relevant care that they would require.
Because there's no choice.
Yes, so they don't have a choice. So they're keeping them at home. They're using the community association to help take care of them. So community associations, they may have a day program for people with dementia, or they may have what now is a Zoom program for people with dementia or seniors who are just feeling lonely or are having other issues, who are maybe not at that level of dementia yet, but are maybe getting there, or maybe, just dealing with the regular issues that seniors deal with, which include isolation, all of those factors. Yeah.
And in this context, I think you spoke about Melody Lowe and her struggle to find care for her mother. Could you take me through that?
I spoke to Melody, and she's from Scarborough. She grew up in Scarborough, and her mom is from Hong Kong. And she came to Canada in the 1970s and raised her and her two other sisters in Scarborough. And her mom, had some awful health issues that happened to her. She ended up having 5 strokes in 2004, and her mom was only 53 when she had these strokes. And those strokes left her mother completely cognitively impaired, and she was never the same again. So she had trouble seeing, she had trouble speaking, she had trouble walking. And Melody and her sisters knew that she would need this care for the rest of her life. And at the time, Melody was only 21 years old, and she decided not to go to work and to stay home and take care of her mother full time. And she and her sisters rotated that care for 3 years until they could get her mother into a culturally relevant home, which is the Yihong location in Scarborough. And they took care of her for those years because they had toured other long-term care homes, and they said, we can absolutely not put our mother into these homes.
What are the ways currently to adapt existing long-term care infrastructures to particular communities? You just brought up the Yihong facility, for example. Is this one of the examples that you came across in your reporting that are working?
Yes. So building these culturally relevant homes is obviously, that's one solution. These homes They ensure that they have medical professionals coming in who are from those backgrounds. They ensure the menu is catered to those elements. They have the cultural celebrations. They have all of that ready to go in the home. But obviously, building these homes, it takes time, and it's not the solution that works for everyone. So many people do not want to put their parents in these homes. And culturally, it may make more sense to focus on community care. So these kinds of structures need to be built up, not just within long-term care homes, but within who can you access from your own home? What medical professionals can you access? What hotlines can you access? And are there readily available resources in the community for you? And that includes just even your family doctor. Are there people you can speak to? For instance, if you're trying to explain what dementia is to older people in your community, who this goes for many, many communities, who may not understand what that illness is or didn't grow up with a lot of discussions around mental health, like what younger people may be used to. So just infusing that kind of care into all levels, that's going to make the difference because, a long-term care home may not be the best solution for every family.
And you talked about Dr. Wong, who's started Yihong, and I believe he had a fair bit of experience working with patients in long-term care homes, and that's what led him to do this. Did he share those experiences with you?
Yes. So, he talked about how in the 1980s, as a doctor, he'd go into these homes and service these long-term care homes. And he would see Chinese seniors in the home who would cry out to him when they saw him pass and speak to him in Mandarin and say, "Please help me." And they were relieved to see someone who they, made the assumption that he would understand what they were saying. And he said that, this broke his heart, essentially, to see these seniors suffer the way they were in these homes where, he was the one doctor in many who was just happened to be passing through the home who they were desperate to speak to. And he thought, it can't be like this. And he talked about, the history of how Chinese people have been treated here in Toronto. And that goes back to the head tax, the ban, the amount of work the community has done to just be treated like people in the city. And to him, this was more of that. In old age, though, again, not getting access to, rights that you should have. And this is why he started Yihong.
And like you mentioned, in old age, and if there's dementia or some kind of cognitive disease, there's a lot of chance of a person reverting back to their past. So in a way, a lot of these elderly immigrants might be revisiting that trauma of discrimination, which is incredibly painful, I can imagine.
Definitely. That's definitely part of it. And that's something that Dr. Samir Sinha, who I spoke to too, who's, one of the top experts on this subject and has given a lot of policy recommendations to the provincial government. That's something that he said that those traumatic memories, he gave the example to me as one of his patients is a Holocaust survivor, and she is reverting back to those times. And how to navigate that is something that a doctor should be aware of.
And Olivia, I wanted to finish with this. I know you've reported on this issue a fair bit, and it's so important to talk about this right now. But you also have a personal story that led you to first start looking into this. Is it okay for you to share that?
Yes, definitely. So I'm half South Asian, and my grandpa, who moved to Canada from India in the late 1950s and brought over my grandma and my mom and everybody, he was diagnosed with dementia in about 2011. And by 2016, it had gotten, so bad that, of course, we had to move him to a long-term care home. And my grandma would go there every day to feed him, to play him music. And he had reverted back to his first language, which is Telugu. And he had been in Canada for decades, in small town Canada. Everybody there only knew English. So he had been speaking English his whole life. So, it's really shocking to see someone lose an entire language. I couldn't communicate with him anymore because I didn't know Telugu. And I could see how he shut down, how he would call out in Telugu and no one would understand. And my grandma being there was his only real comfort because they were married since their early 20s. That was his memory. And having PSWs, even them just being South Asian, I could tell brought him comfort, which, was so strange to see as he was someone who was in Canada for decades and had friends of all different backgrounds. But when he reverted back to, it was clear he didn't know who any of us were. He didn't know where he was. And in his mind, I think he was a kid in India. That's where he was in his mind. So he was only calm and comfortable when he had those elements with him. And otherwise, he would do things like scream and cry and just completely break down. And we could only get him to be calm when these elements were there. So, I totally saw how it made a huge difference for him.
Right. You saw it firsthand, and this must be very heartbreaking for you and your family seeing and going through all of that. Thank you for sharing, Olivia, and thank you for your time and insight.
Thank you so much for having me.
I was talking to Olivia Bowden. She's a reporter for the Toronto Star, and she's got a piece on this coming out soon, so keep your eyes open for that. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Saba Eitizaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.